There is a silence in the American Southwest that doesn't feel natural. Stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon at dawn, before the tourists arrive, before the park rangers open their gates, before the world fills up with noise, and you will feel it. Not just the quiet. Something else. A weight to the air. A stillness that seems to come not from above, but from below. As if the earth itself is holding a breath it has never let go. The Grand Canyon is, officially, one of the most studied geological formations on the planet. Scientists have mapped it, measured it, dated it. They will tell you everything about it, how it formed over 5 million years as the Colorado River carved through layered sedimentary rock. They'll show you the strata like pages of a book. They'll give you names for every color band, every exposed era of time written in stone. It is, they say, a perfectly understood place. But here's what makes this strange. In the spring of last year, a team running quantum resonance imaging scans, a technology initially developed for deep subsurface military mapping, detected something that had no entry in any geological file, no record in any academic paper, no acknowledgement in any federal survey. Roughly 400 feet below the canyon's northern floor, the scans returned an anomaly. Not a cave, not a water pocket, not a fault line. Something shaped, something hollow, something that, by every metric the technology could produce, should not exist beneath a natural geological formation. They ran the scans again. Same result. They recalibrated the equipment. Same result. They brought in a second team. Same result. And then, quietly, the preliminary report was filed internally. It was not published. It was not announced. It was not denied. It simply disappeared into the architecture of institutional silence that has surrounded the Grand Canyon for over a century. This is where the story shifts. The Grand Canyon sits on land managed by the National Park Service, a branch of the United States Department of the Interior. It is one of the most legally protected and access-restricted natural spaces in the country. There are areas of the canyon floor and inner canyon that require special permits, military clearance, or tribal consultation before any research team can legally operate. That is officially justified by conservation concerns, by respect for indigenous land rights, by the fragility of the ecosystem, all of which are legitimate, all of which are real, and yet, none of which fully explains why certain deep subsurface research proposals submitted by independent geological teams in the last 2 decades have been quietly denied, redirected, or simply never approved. Not rejected, just never answered. Pause on that for a moment. Because this pattern, the non-answer, is one of the most sophisticated forms of information management ever developed. You cannot argue with a silence. You cannot appeal a non-decision. You cannot challenge an approval that simply never came. To understand what may lie beneath the Grand Canyon, we have to begin not with the scan. We have to begin with what was already known, or rather, what was already found, and then inexplicably buried. In 1909, the Arizona Gazette published what remains one of the most extraordinary and disputed news stories in American history. The headline read, "Explorations in Grand Canyon. Mysteries of immense high cavern being brought to light." The article described an expedition led by a man named G.E. Kincaid, allegedly funded by the Smithsonian Institution, which had discovered a massive underground chamber in the eastern canyon walls. The article described carved passageways, stone tablets with unknown hieroglyphic-style script, metallic artifacts of unknown composition, mummified remains. A chamber that, Kincaid allegedly reported, showed clear signs of deliberate architectural construction, not natural formation, not erosion, not accident, design. The Smithsonian has denied this story for over 100 years. They state there is no record of a G.E. Kincaid in their employment archives, no record of any such expedition, no record of any such discovery. And the Arizona Gazette story has never been independently corroborated. Officially, the 1909 story is a hoax, a fabrication, a late frontier-era yellow journalism piece designed to sell newspapers. and that may well be true. But here's what makes this strange. The 1909 story described very specific architectural features, passageways oriented on a specific east-to-west axis, chambers at specific depths, artifacts made of an alloy described as unlike bronze or copper, but combining characteristics of both. It described these details with a precision that would have been difficult to fabricate credibly in 1909 without some reference point. And when quantum resonance researchers, working with no knowledge of and no reference to the 1909 article, returned their anomalous subsurface scan data last year, the hollow structure they detected was positioned at a depth and on an axis that aligned within a degree of error with the directional orientation described in the Kincaid report. That is either an extraordinary coincidence, or it is something else entirely. The technology behind quantum resonance subsurface imaging is not science fiction. It is not fringe. It is a descendant of muon tomography, a technique that uses naturally occurring subatomic particles called muons, which rain down from the upper atmosphere at a near constant rate, to image the interior of dense structures in the same way that X-rays image the interior of the human body. This technology was used in 2017 to discover a previously unknown void inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, a chamber the size of a commercial aircraft, hidden for 4,000 years inside one of the most studied structures in human history. That discovery was announced by a peer-reviewed team. It was published in Nature. It was impossible to dismiss. And yet 4 years later, Egyptian authorities had still not approved any physical investigation of the void. Let that land. The void in the Great Pyramid is confirmed, peer-reviewed, publicly announced, and no one has been permitted to look inside it. Now we have a second void, beneath the Grand Canyon, detected by a different team using a related methodology in a completely different geological context. And the report is not even public. We are not talking about one anomaly. We are beginning to see a pattern. When archaeologists speak about anomalous subterranean structures, they work within a very specific conceptual framework. Natural voids form through well-understood geological processes: water erosion, lava tube formation, salt dissolution, tectonic fracturing. These processes leave signatures, irregular walls, asymmetric shapes, unpredictable spatial relationships. What the quantum resonance scans returned from beneath the Grand Canyon's northern floor was not any of those things. It was described in the internal preliminary report, which was leaked to a single independent researcher before being retracted, as displaying what the technicians called geometric regularity. The walls of the void appeared smooth. The dimensions followed a ratio. The internal structure suggested, in the words of the original notation, a possible artificial origin. Possible. That word was used deliberately. It is the most careful word in science. It doesn't claim. It doesn't confirm. It opens a door and then waits. Here is where we need to stop and think carefully about what we are actually saying, because the implication, if the scan is accurate, if the geometric regularity is real, if the orientation matches the 1909 report, the implication is not just that there is an interesting archaeological discovery waiting beneath the Grand Canyon. The implication is something far larger, far older, far more destabilizing to everything we think we know about the history of human civilization on this continent. The accepted timeline of advanced human settlement in North America begins approximately 13,000 years ago with the Clovis people. Before that, the continent is presumed to have been uninhabited by technologically sophisticated groups. This is not a fringe claim. It is the foundational consensus of American archaeology, and it rests on a very specific kind of evidence: what has been found. It does not, cannot, account for what has never been looked for, or what has been found and not disclosed. The Grand Canyon region has been continuously inhabited by various indigenous peoples for at least 12,000 years by conservative estimate. The Havasupai, the Hualapai, the Navajo, the Hopi. Each of these nations has oral traditions, cosmological frameworks, and ancestral narratives that describe underground worlds. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The Hopi cosmology in particular describes a series of underground worlds, previous ages of humanity, from which the current world emerged. They call the place of emergence the Sipapuni. It is located, according to Hopi cosmology, in the inner canyon of the Grand Canyon. It is revered. It is specific. It is not a vague spiritual metaphor. It is a geographical coordinate embedded in 10,000 years of oral tradition. Western archaeology has largely treated these accounts as mythology, as rich cultural narrative, as spiritual truth rather than historical record. And perhaps that distinction between myth and history is the real question this documentary is asking. Because there is an increasing body of evidence, from linguistics to archaeology to genetics, suggesting that oral traditions encode factual historical information with a fidelity that can span geological timescales. Indigenous Australian oral traditions, for example, have been independently confirmed to accurately describe coastline geography that changed when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, more than 10,000 years ago. The traditions were not metaphor, they were memory. So when the Hopi say the Grand Canyon contains an entrance to an underground world, not a symbol, not a story, but a place, perhaps the question we should be asking is not whether they believe that, but whether they remember it. This is the philosophical center of everything this discovery points toward. Not just the what, the why it was never looked for, the why the 1909 report was dismissed without investigation, the why the quantum scan report was filed and then not published, the why the independent research applications were never approved. There is a specific kind of intellectual discomfort that institutions, universities, federal agencies, national museums experience when evidence arrives that challenges load-bearing assumptions. Not because the people within those institutions are malicious. Most scientists are not. Most archaeologists are not. Most Park Service administrators are not. But institutions, by their nature, protect the frameworks that justify their existence. An archaeological institution built on a specific timeline of American civilization has a structural incentive, not a conscious one, but a structural one, to resist evidence that would require that timeline to be fundamentally reconstructed. Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science, called this paradigm resistance. He described how, in the history of every major scientific revolution, anomalous data was systematically dismissed, minimized, and institutionally ignored until the weight of evidence became so overwhelming that the old framework collapsed all at once. The collapse was not gradual. The resistance was gradual. The collapse was sudden. He called it a paradigm shift. And he noted, with great care, that the people who resisted the shift were not stupid. They were invested. That is a different thing entirely. The quantum resonance void beneath the Grand Canyon may be nothing. It may be an equipment artifact, a geological quirk that the technology misread, a coincidence of shape that mimics geometric regularity without actually being artificial. That is possible. That is genuinely possible. But the decision not to investigate it, or rather, the non-decision, the silence, that is not a coincidence. That is a choice. And choices, even silent ones, have reasons. Now consider this. The Grand Canyon was formally closed to unrestricted private exploration in 1919 with the establishment of Grand Canyon National Park. Before that, in the decades following the Civil War, independent prospectors, ethnographers, and adventurers moved through the canyon with relative freedom. Dozens of reports from that era described unusual finds in the inner canyon. Carved walls, sealed passages, chambers with signs of ancient habitation far beyond what accepted Native American archaeology of the time could explain. Most of those reports were filed with the newly formed Bureau of American Ethnology, an arm of the Smithsonian, and then archived. Not published, not investigated, archived. Some have since disappeared entirely from the public record. The pattern is not new. The silence has a long history. In 2003, a team of independent researchers submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the National Park Service for any subsurface survey data collected in the Northern Canyon region between 1970 and 2003. The request was partially granted. Some documents were released. Others were withheld under exemptions related to national security and sensitive archaeological site protection. National security. That phrase, applied to geological survey data in a national park, was not explained further. It was simply invoked. A natural geological void does not require a national security exemption. An artificial one, or even a suspected artificial one, might. We are now at a point in this story where the evidence, taken individually, can be explained away. The 1909 newspaper story, journalism fraud. The scan anomaly, equipment error. The FOIA exemptions, routine bureaucratic caution. The oral traditions, beautiful mythology. The denied research applications, standard permitting backlog. Take any one of these and you can find a comfortable, ordinary explanation. That is the nature of this kind of evidence. It is not built to withstand single scrutiny. It is built to be understood in accumulation. Because what we are looking at, in accumulation, is not a series of coincidences. It is a structure. A consistent, decades-long pattern of non-investigation surrounding one of the most geologically unique locations on the North American continent. A pattern that begins before the era of modern archaeology, continues through the Cold War, persists into the present digital age, and now, with the emergence of non-invasive imaging technology that requires no permit, no physical access, no institutional approval, has produced something that cannot be archived or exempted into silence. The scans exist. The anomaly exists. The data has been seen by multiple technicians who do not know each other, working independently, who reach the same description. The only question left is what the anomaly is. And the only way to answer that question is for someone to go and look. That moment, the moment when not looking becomes harder to justify than looking, may be approaching. Muon tomography and quantum resonance imaging are becoming increasingly accessible. Independent research teams are operating outside institutional frameworks with increasing capability. The data cannot be permanently suppressed when the technology to regenerate it is no longer controlled by any single entity. The Giza void was discovered by a collaborative international team that bypassed Egyptian institutional resistance through sheer weight of independent verification. The same process may now be beginning beneath the American Southwest. What would it mean, genuinely, philosophically, historically, if there is an artificial structure beneath the Grand Canyon? Not a small cave with a few artifacts. A structure, a large, geometrically regular, deliberately constructed space at a depth that implies either extraordinary engineering capability or extraordinary age, or both. What would it mean for the timeline, for the textbooks, for the entire framework of American prehistory, for the relationship between settler institutions and indigenous oral knowledge, for the definition of civilization itself? It would mean that something happened on this continent, something involving intelligence, construction, intention, that has been either unknown or unacknowledged for long enough to be written entirely out of history, and that the landscape of the American West, which we walk through and photograph and post to social media as a backdrop for our vacations, is not an empty stage. It is an archive, a library, a record of something that preceded everything we think we know. The void beneath the Grand Canyon is not, in the end, just a geological curiosity. It is a question, addressed to all of us, about what we are willing to see, about what we are willing to ask, about who gets to decide what counts as history and what gets filed under silence. There are places in the world where the past is not behind us, where it is beneath us, waiting, as it has always waited, with the patience of stone. The scan has been run. The anomaly has been recorded. The silence has been noted. What happens next depends entirely on how many people refuse to stop asking. If you found yourself leaning forward during this, if something in you recognized the weight of what is not being said as much as what is, then you already understand what this channel is about. The Vault of Secrets exists for exactly this kind of inquiry, not for answers handed down from authority, not for comfortable certainties, but for the questions that institutional frameworks cannot absorb, for the anomalies that survive every attempt at ordinary explanation, for the history that lives beneath the history we were given. There is more to investigate here. The 1909 documents that no one has fully cross-referenced with the modern scan data, the FOIA materials that were partially released and have never been systematically analyzed, the indigenous oral traditions that have never been formally compared against subsurface geographical data, the Giza Void, and what it shares architecturally with what the Grand Canyon scan returned. We are at the beginning of this, not the end. If you want to be part of this investigation, not as a passive viewer, but as someone who thinks, questions, connects, subscribe. Not because we ask you to, but because you understand that this kind of inquiry requires a community of minds that are willing to stay with the uncomfortable question, to not reach for the easy explanation, to sit with the anomaly long enough to understand what it is actually asking. The canyon is still there. The void is still there. The scans are still there. And somewhere in the institutional archives of the American Southwest, so is the silence. The only question is, are you willing to listen to it? The Vault of Secrets, where history hides, we look.